Hello, and welcome back to the final session of the Measuring the Biofield, Exploring the Science of Energy Healing Symposium. My name is Ramses de Leon, and I will be your host for this final session. We have with us Dr. Ross Dunseath, who will present human electrostatic field measures in copper wall replication study. Ross Dunseath, Ph.D., is an electrical engineer who first encountered the wild world of psi research as a student at Duke University in the previous century. After working on a dry electrode biosensors in a biofeedback lab at Duke and inventing instrumentation for combined EEG and fMRI neuroimaging in a startup venture, he joined the Westfall Neuroimaging Lab at the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia and is also the research coordinator at the Monroe Institute. Present interests include neuroimaging of altered state of consciousness and psi phenomena, psi sensors, and the biofield measurement. We'll reproduce the video presentation of Dr. Dunseath, and he will join us at the end for the Q&A shortly afterwards.
Human electrostatic field research at the Monroe Institute. I got started on this by making some observations at a different Monroe Institute program called MC squared. In that program, we were experimenting with PK detection systems, and I had some that were extremely well shielded for electrical interference. And yet I observed that one particular participant was a massage therapist from Romania, was able to elicit a response on a fairly sensitive electric field detector that had 120 dB of shielding around it. In order for that to happen, she must have had a few hundred volts or so thereabouts on her hands. Now, ordinarily what we would say is, oh, that was a static charge buildup from the rug or whatnot, triboelectric effects. However, the problem with that was it was pretty damp on that particular evening, and we ran at least 25 or 30 different people sitting in front of that device. Nobody elicited any type of response like that. So that was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that. Then Joe Gallenberger, who's the trainer of the MC Square program, also showed me how he can light up a fluorescent tube. And he just showed me this down in a damp basement so we could rule out, again, static charge from triboelectric effects. It took him a while to get into the zone to do this, but when he did, and he moved his fingers across that fluorescent tube, it definitely was flickering, and it wasn't doing that previous to when he felt like he was able to do that. I also saw some very large voltages on a biofield therapist, Ed Edwards. And in both this case with Edwards and Joe Gallenberger, I was using a handheld electrostatic meter, just not extremely accurate. But in the Ed Edwards case, he was sitting in a chair and doing his biofield therapy thing. And my static field meter was again showing maybe a couple hundred volts. To control for that, I had other people who were present sit in the same chair and measured around them, nothing. So again, this was not a case of static electricity from a rug. So with those types of observations already in my mind, I recalled that there was a Elmer Green and company paper called Anomalous Electrostatic Phenomena and Exceptional Subjects. This was published in 1991 in Subtle Energies, Volume 2, Number 3. And in that paper, they described building a special electrostatic environment for measuring just exactly these types of voltages. And we'll get into the results that they found in a minute. There's also another really nice paper by Green in Subtle Energies and Energy Medicine, Volume 10. I'm not sure what year that is because they don't put the years on their papers, called Copper Wall Research, Psychology and Psychophysics. And then in 1995, Tiller Green and company published in the Journal for Scientific Exploration, Volume 9, Number 3, towards explaining anomalously large body voltage surges on exceptional subjects. Part 1, the electrostatic approximation, in which they come up with an equivalent electrical model for what's going on and the measurements they made and some theories as to why it's happening. So getting back to Elmer Green was had come across a book called The Mahatma Letters to A.P. Senate in the 1880s, published in the 1880s. And in this book, A.P. Senate was a editor of a newspaper in India. The Mahatma Letters were various communiques he got from folks in India, teachers, and this one was particularly intriguing. Let me read this for you. The methods used for developing lucidity in our chelas, which are the meditation students, may be easily used by you. Every temple has a dark room, the north wall of which is entirely covered with a sheet of mixed metal, chiefly copper, very highly polished, with a surface capable of reflecting in it things, as well as a mirror. The chela sits on an insulated stool, a three-legged bench placed in a flat-bottomed vessel of thick glass. The Lama operator likewise, the two forming with the mirror wall a triangle. A magnet with the north pole up is suspended over the crown of the chela's head without touching it. The operator, having started the thing going, leaves the chela alone, gazing on the wall, and after the third time is no longer required. Now, as Elmer Green points out in that second paper I referenced, part of what's really interesting about this is they really seem to be saying that electric and magnetic fields can possibly be used in consciousness exploration. So here we have a insulator, the vessel of thick glass, which is electrically insulating the people in it sitting there from touching ground. So anything that's going on electrically in their body is not going to bleed off. The magnet is suspended over the crown of the chela's head. Now here's another thing that's really intriguing about this. The operator, having started the thing going, leaves the chela alone gazing on the wall, and after the third time is no longer required. So what does that mean? Started the thing going and then is no longer required after the third time. So Elmer Green was speculating that somehow the student was learning some sort of technique and after the third time had it down, didn't need the teacher anymore. So Green and company at the Menninger Institute went on to build a copper wall. And what they did was they decided that those copper walls, which as you saw in that previous quote, were reflecting, they even said a thing, well, a floating copper metallic wall will be an image of an electric field. So they were approaching like that, built originally just a single wall, but then a four-wall lab at the Menninger Institute. And if you'll notice from this diagram, first of all, on the bottom, they've got glass blocks. So that's approximating the glass vessel. That's insulating the person sitting in that room from earth contact, which goes both ways. They're not on a rug where they could be getting electrostatic effects. And they're also not where if there is charge building up in their body, it could bleed off into the environment. Then they had double walls. These are walls of copper, Cu, and then I think about 4 inches away was one of aluminum. The outside aluminum walls were grounded. The inside copper walls were connected to the electrometer. Electrometers are extremely sensitive voltmeters that have extremely high impedances and resistance. So again, they will be the least likely to disturb this particular measurement by allowing charge to bleed off through the voltmeter. You use just a regular voltmeter for this kind of measurement, the odds are that you will get inaccurate or at least reduced readings. So they also had the magnet suspended over the head. This was the model that we used to build a similar type of facility at the Monroe Institute. We did not use the magnet, and I will get into that why in a minute. And we only have one electrometer. So you can see in this 4-wall lab diagram, they had electrometers on the 4 walls, front, back, up, and down, but they had also another electrometer connected to the body. They connected to the earlobe. So that's what we did. We connected to the body. We still had the copper walls for people to look at. And actually, I will show you what we built at Monroe. Looks a little fuzzy. I don't know why. Anyway, our copper wall facility is not quite as big as the Menninger Institute version. It's really more like a booth, but it's big enough for one person to sit in. We have copper panels on the top and bottom, and then on the front and back walls, instead of the one single large panel, we actually split it into 2 separate panels with the hope that maybe we could get a little more resolution on the reading. But as I will get into in a minute, probably what you need to do is make a much smaller probe to get really accurate field measures. But this is what Green and company did. They used these copper walls to get electric field measures. So they're actually seeing and measuring an electric field from the human body. And then they had the one connection on the earlobe as well. One difference in our setup from what the Menninger setup was, if you look at the floor there, we have a layer of glass, a thick glass pane that's sitting on top of the copper sheet. And that's our insulator. So I couldn't find glass bricks in Charlottesville, Virginia. So we used the glass, and that's actually a little bit closer to the glass vessel that's described in the Mahatma letter. However, when you use glass like this, it does introduce one issue that people need to be very careful about, and that is rubber and I think silk materials on glass will cause charge separation. So we had to be really careful about that source of artifact in the reading. Here's another view of the facility at the Monroe Institute looking from the opposite direction. As you can see there on the front panel are 2 copper walls insulated from each other, 2 copper panels. And then right next to the facility is a bench for all the instrumentation. So as I mentioned previously, we were using a single electrometer. It was Keithley 6514, which was the next generation up from the electrometer used in the Menninger research, which was I think a Keithley 614. This particular version, the 6514, has a large voltage range. It can read up to 200 volts DC offset, which is important, as we will see in a minute. And it's got a somewhat limited AC output bandwidth that can be used for recording AC excursions as well. We connected up to that AC outlet with a digitizer and a recording device, but it had a high pass filter on it, which we have to have. We cannot record hugely high DC potentials. And as we will see in a minute, I think that distorted our AC readings, which is partly why what I'm about to disclose here was a pilot study and not a formal study. We were doing a lot of experimentation as well with artifact control. So for example, you can see this nice little chair that we originally used, that turned out to be not a good thing to do. So First of all, that cushion on it, when people would move, would cause electrostatic artifact, interfere with the readings. And the chair itself seemed to be able to absorb some charge from the body. So we had one case where the person sitting in the chair was getting low voltage readings and then stood up and we moved the chair out. And lo and behold, we started seeing higher voltage readings. So the results I'm presenting today are a mixed bag of exploration and, maybe the second half of it, we had our chops down a little bit better. That's why it's a pilot study. We used a computer you can't see there, a monitor, video camera. We were recording as they did in the Green research. As people were in the copper wall being measured, we were recording that to try to control for movement artifact. So our basic protocol really in the beginning was just see if we could replicate some of the effects that the Green research reported. And then we added a little bit of a twist to it, which I will get into in a minute. So what did Green see? Large voltage offsets and pulses primarily in healers. So Elmer Green describes in that second paper, the Copper Wall Research, Psychology and Psychophysics, and also the original one, they ran probably 600 observations on regular meditators, like staff folks and just folks who were just regular meditators, didn't really see a whole lot of action. Decided that they should maybe look at people who were more affecting the environment around them. And so sensitives, as he called them, healers. So they got about, I think, six or eight healers. And on these people, they started to see some large scale voltage activity. So if we take a look at this chart here, on the right side of the scale is the wall voltage, and you can see the wall voltages are just 0 through 3 volts, but that body potential, that's running 50 some volts in this particular case. They saw people, several cases of these high voltages, and then on top of that, they also saw these pulses that you can see in this chart. So if you look at that particular trace, it's labeled VB. That's starting out, that's the body voltage. It's starting out with an offset of 45 volts to begin with, which is crazy. There's if that's not electrostatic charge buildup from like triboelectric, which is two materials rubbing against each other, or some other aspect of the environment, which it should not be because they were really careful about controlling for artifact. If it's not artifact, how do you explain 45 volts, just DC potential appearing on somebody's body? I mean, that to me is question number one. But then they got these large scale pulses that would appear periodically. So as you can see in this case, that pulse is going from about 45 volts down to about 0, 45 volt pulse. Over the span of these things Elmer Green was describing, they're running from about, I think around 2 to 10 or 12 seconds in length. So they're very slow, but they're very large. And that second pulse is even bigger. So that one's running about 55 volts. And he had many instances, many observations of these. This particular graph here is the version they used to come up with the model that we'll talk about in a minute. So, we were looking initially for pulses because, well, that's the big wild thing. Let's see if we can see some pulses. And as I mentioned before, our AC recording system had a high pass filter in it. We saw pulses for sure. And under pretty well controlled conditions, but they were much smaller than these pulses that the Green team found. And I'm almost certain it's because the high pass filter in our recording system was not capable of dropping down low enough in frequency to capture these slow pulses. So we had a taste of it. We think they're there. And because we realized the limitation in our recording system, we started just focusing on that DC offset, which, in and of itself, I mean, what's the most that we should see on a human body? It would be from galvanic skin potential, which is, half a volt at best. And here are these people, some of them were getting, way higher voltages than 45 volts. I think Green listed one of the pulses they saw was 200 volts in amplitude. So the offset must have been huge to begin with. So what we did was started just tracking DC offsets and trying to run as many people as we could. Mostly Monroe Institute participants who are a really nice self-selected group. These people are interested in things like energy manipulation and healing and things like that. So, we started just doing that version of the study. And what we found was we have 42 observations. We saw they range from -6 volts to 70 volts. Most of them, as you can see from this little dot histogram, were centered in the low voltage range, 0 to 2 volts or thereabout. Now, what Green and Company did was they checked for artifact by having people roll their heads and move around and whatnot, and they decided on a threshold value of 4 volts as being artifact. I think that was primarily for AC measurements. But if you just take that for the DC offset as well, we were getting several readings that were above 4 volts. Now, some of these cases we did with healers who were working on the healee who was in the copper wall room. So we measure voltage offsets on healees, and then in other cases, most of the other cases, the healer or a Monroe participant were sitting in the copper wall room, either doing a healing visualization or an energy visualization. So the standard protocol we ended up using was to have a person sit there for perhaps 10 minutes while we get a baseline, make sure that baseline is stable, and then ask them to go ahead and visualize energy or healing, whatever aspect that they felt like would be sort of raising energy in their body. And a lot of these folks do get reasonably high voltages. Even the low voltages, we saw some of them double and triple. So although they may not have, exceeded 4 volts, they were moving when they started visualizing the energy. So, which suggested to us that this could be, as they were using in the Mahatma letter, this could be an interesting way to help people get feedback on their energy visualization. Now, of course, the issue with all this is that just because you see a voltage on the body, is that a necessary condition for a person to be accumulating energy or feeling better or healing? Perhaps not. But on the other hand, perhaps it is a method for eliciting that type of energy. So in the Elmer Green, or the Tiller and Green et al. Paper, they took that pulse chart, that data that I just showed you, and they worked out an equivalent dipole in the body. So they were able to do this because they had enough measurements from the walls in the body. And what they found was for the pulse events, uh, there was a charge separation equivalent dipole that extended from about the feet to the head, seemed to have started in the solar plexus area, or the dantian, and extend out from there. They calculated that it took all of 1/10 of a nanoampere of current to cause this effect to occur over the span of about 1 second. So if you consider that, that's extremely small current. And I think that supports the idea that, because so little charge is going on with this phenomena, that you have to be careful about how to measure it. This has to be done in an electrostatically isolated and shielded environment to get accurate readings on this. Okay, so the other thing that we observed, similar to what Elmer Green was seeing, was that there are exceptional cases. And I would say we had about 5 of them. So you can see that, there's a few of these rather large scale voltages out there. And so at 50 and at 70 volts, those were 2 healers. One of them, again, was Ed Edwards. Another was his healing partner, Leahy Introp. They generated this on a couple of occasions, to 50 and 70 volts. Didn't do it all the time, but they certainly were able to achieve that. I think when I see stuff like that, I just start thinking in my mind, okay, where is this leakage? Where's the electrostatic effect occurring? What are we missing here? So, as we proceed with a formal study at Monroe Institute, one of the first things we're doing is, as I mentioned, that glass floor, we're putting down a carbon-loaded foam pad. So, just completely rule out any effect with charge separation occurring between glass and other materials. Now, almost all of our participants in our pilot study were barefoot because we were doing this in the summer. They would just take off their sandals or whatnot, and we substituted a wooden bar stool for that wicker chair you saw. And so they were pretty much barefoot and either sitting or sort of, leaning up against the bar stool, because that measurement is really best made if you're standing up. But a lot of people, after 10 or 15 minutes of standing up, they might start wobbling a little, which could be a source of artifact. Seems like a good compromise. Is the bar stool is pretty high up. You can sort of half sit and half stand on those and be comfortable. So, we're getting the carbon loaded pad. We've got that down on the glass. We've got some rugs in the area that we're just completely getting rid of. You see that 35 volt source that was on the histogram chart there. That was actually a healee who was undergoing the healing treatment. The healer was standing outside the copper wall room, but there was a carpet there. And while he was standing very quietly, I don't think there was any electrostatic. We're just going whole hog to remove any possibility. Another thing that we do when we run these measurements is when the person first gets into the copper wall booth, we have them touch a grounded like metal knob and drain off any extraneous charge they already have on their body. So they're basically starting from scratch. Now getting back to Green and Tiller, they had some theories as to what's going on here, which is a really interesting question, because, is this a case of charge separation occurring in the body, which is the model that they used for the pulse. Remember, that's the pulse. However, I did not see in their paper anywhere where there was any kind of model explaining, why is there 50, 70, even 100 volts appearing on a human body? Keep in mind that these measurements are made between the body and the earth ground. Okay, so this is sort of a relationship between human and environment. Nonetheless, how do you get those high voltages? So one theory might be, well, people are absorbing charge. Just they can do that. And maybe everybody's got the capability of doing that if they can learn how. So that might be, a truly physical phenomenon that people can learn to do. And that's actually what we have in mind at Monroe, is if we can get this measurement technique down and very routine and have a study showing it's reliable. We're also doing subjective surveys with our participants, so we can see if higher voltages are corresponding to a felt sense of energy, for example. So that's number one. Is there an absorption of charge somehow from the environment? It's coming from the sun. I mean, what is this? And then, of course, number two is the pulse. Now, in the Tiller-Green model, as I mentioned before, there was a charge separation starting in the Dantian or the hara and moving to the extremes of the body. So, and it took very little current to do it. So that seems to me to be a pretty good model for the pulse. And the pulse seems like, as they described it, a reset of some kind. So the healer is building up this energy, and periodically it's reset. And based on William Teller's theories about things, he considered it to be an effect, a bridge between a subtle energy body and the physical body. And he thought well, the bridge was a vector magnetic potential. So there was a vector magnetic potential pulse. When that occurred, the electric and magnetic field pulses followed. And speaking of the magnetic field, I mentioned we took the magnet out because Elmer Green and company also removed that magnet when they were doing the work with the healers. However, they had done some previous work where they were doing surveys, and they found some really interesting effects with that magnet. Males and females had almost polar opposite reactions to whether the magnet was aligned north to the top or north to the facing down. And there were differences based on the magnetic intensity of the magnet used. But he did not use it for the healer research. That's part of the reason we didn't. We also didn't use it because these magnets are kind of heavy, and it just seemed a little dicey to be hanging these over the heads of our participants at Monroe. So going forward, we are going to, as I mentioned, be doing this study. We hope to get a better recording apparatus, but until we do, we're just starting with the DC potentials and with very carefully controlled environment. We want to get a profile of what various Monroe participants and healers are doing. Another thing that we're going to use is a cosmic ray detector that we're mounting on top of the copper wall ceiling. And this is basically riffing off of Sue Benford's research. I don't have I'm sorry, I should have put that on the slide, but she and some others did a study where they found that the background gamma radiation as measured overhead of a healer and a healee in a healing session, background radiation detected was lower during the healing session, statistically significantly lower. So a lot of that background gamma that they're measuring is coming from cosmic ray sources. Some of it's coming from radon or whatnot, but a lot of it's cosmic ray. And we do have a cosmic ray detection system that has now been put up on top of that copper wall roof. We're going to be running that. We're also running a random number generator. Some of our initial pilot studies had a random number generator running. What we saw was with the two healers, Ed and Leahy, almost every one of their healing sessions we ran over the course of about 3 days, had the RNG going off random, and then baseline monitoring before and after was not. The random number generator was random. So we're going to have multiple sensors involved in this, and hopefully get that pulse AC measurement up and running as well. So that's pretty much the state of where we are with copper well research at the Monroe Institute. We're hoping to start in August with the subtle energy medicine or energy medicine program that will be happening in August. Get some folks up there and look and see what's going on. And that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for your interest.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Dunseath. That was wonderful. There you go. There's your microphone activated. And before we go to the Q&A, which I can see that there are some piling questions already, I want to remember the speakers and the CC members that they can raise their hand to be put on the stage and ask their questions to Dr. Dunseath. All attendees are invited to use the Q&A section for the written questions or to upvote others' questions, which I may ask directly to our speaker. So I will show the first question that we have over here. This is from Arlene Hopkins. And she's asking, on the first part of your presentation, you mentioned about these silk materials. So regarding silk materials and glass causing charge separation, will other protein fiber-based fabrics, such as woolens, also cause charge separation? If so, then might there be implications for clothing, beddings, furnishing, etc.?
Yeah, I think definitely wool will do it. I do think there are implications for us in our measurement. We got to watch out what people have on, say, for example, socks, and what the socks are made of. That's why we put this carbon-loaded foam pad down. And what I'm doing, I'm at the point now where I'm just going to test before we go, because this is a really big, important question, and we don't want to take any chances on it. But to answer your question, yeah, definitely will, and probably others as well.
All right, awesome.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. Do you have any other comments regarding that question?
I was going to throw cotton in there. I'm not sure about cotton either.
Right. Okay, so Eric Delin from France is asking, so the voltage was measured on the surface of the body?
Right, so we were measuring mostly earlobe. We had just like a little metal earlobe clip that's connected straight into the plus input of the electrometer. The minus input of the electrometer is connected to earth ground. We also used a wrist strap, electrostatic type wrist strap that people use to cut down on charge buildup, for example, when they're handling electric devices. One of those. We put that on the wrist and on the ankle. We tried some of those settings. Ultimately, we're just going to stick with the earlobe.
Right. Excellent. So I think that answered that question in particular. So let's see. William Hill asks regarding the Menninger copper wall setup. The Menninger copper wall setup was conducted in a room within a Faraday cage. Did you have such a cage in your experiments?
My understanding of the way that the Menninger setup was the Faraday cage effect was coming from those aluminum walls on the outside of the room. So if you remember from that diagram, they had the floating copper walls, panels on the inside, and then separated by about 4 inches on the other side of the wall were copper panels. And those copper panels were grounded to earth ground through the electrometers. Now, what we've done at Monroe, and this is a really good question, it's important. first of all, I didn't mention it in the presentation, but that copper wall facility is basically under ground level. So the very top of it, up there at the very top, is ground level. And our walls have the aluminum grounded outside edges. Two of those walls are wide open. There's no walls or anything else, so there's no shielding there. So it's not theoretically a complete closed Faraday cage. But what we are looking at here is low frequency stuff. Our worst offender, the thing we have to deal with the most, is power line interference. And just using those grounded aluminum plates cuts that down quite considerably. You don't have to have a complete shielded Faraday cage to get really good electrostatic reduction for power line interference. And likewise, because we are underground, I ran several months of data collection when COVID shut us down in 2020, where I just had the measurement apparatus sitting there. Wasn't connected to a body, it was sitting on the bar stool. So, a reasonable model. Looking to see if things like clouds floating by would cause changes, because clouds have a charge on them. Did not see anything like that. Now, on the AC side, if there's a thunderstorm lurking within 10 miles, you can see pulses from lightning strikes, but they do look different they're a lot sharper. They're not the same as these slower ones that Green and company were seeing.
All right.
So, yeah.
So one of the full members of the SEC, Marcia Adams, has her hand raised allegorically. So I'll hand her the mic so she can ask you her question directly. So, hello, Marcia. Marcia, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can see her question over here. So are you aware that people can pick up voltages from wiring in the walls acting as antenna? Absolutely. Oh, yes, indeed. You can get several hundred millivolts of induced AC on a person from power line. Now, again, we are running bandwidths that are much lower than 60 hertz. So it's not really an issue for us.
All right. Okay, so we'll pass to the next question. One is from Professor Robert Patterson. Did you ground the subject and then see if the voltage reappeared?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So, as I mentioned, we were routinely letting people briefly touch the ground when they first entered the chamber. And you could see that would run their reading to 0 or very close to it. And then it would start moving up to somewhere where it would become stable. Now, if you're saying, do we, when, somebody got like 50 volts or something, ground them at that point and then see if it immediately bounced back? No, we didn't do that.
All right. So there seems to be an interesting proposal for next studies or next follow-ups. So William Beatty is also asking any unexplained small slow waves on your graphs, possibly synced with breathing, and he's speculating a long-powered electrostatic source. Any comments on that?
Yeah, we did not have people doing like deep breathing. So I can't say that we saw anything like that. Now, on that plot I showed of the pulses from the Green study, there was sort of a sine wave going along. And as Professor Moga was pointing out, Elmer Green described that as the healer, moving their hands back and forth. In a way, it was a demonstration of how that kind of movement artifact is pretty damn small compared to that gigantic offset he got and the big pulses. I do believe they did some deep breathing controls with the Green study as well, and deep breathing, head movements, and things like that to come up with their 4-volt threshold. So they said 4 volts was about the maximum of any artifact that they saw, and people getting above 4 volts under that control condition, it was anomalous.
Very interesting. Okay, thank you. Um, a follow-up question on Wellenberry, we'll go with that also. So regarding the humidity controls in the box, he says that well above 4% RH artifacts should vanish.
Yeah, so we're really running about 50%, 50 to 55%. And no, we could still see some artifacts even at that level of humidity, especially that wicker chair and that cushion, or somebody standing outside the room on the rug that's right there. They jump up and down and scuff their feet. You can see artifact. It doesn't show up as much in that DC measure. That's much more stable. But the AC measure is the one that's very susceptible to those kinds of artifacts.
Right? Okay, okay. So the questions keep coming. So here's one from George Hathaway. So regarding if are fully guarded cables being used in your research, is this ES voltimeter inside or outside the chamber, and why four independent walls?
Hey, great questions. Yes, we're using guard-driven cables. That's comes standard with that Keithley electrometer. Um, it is located outside the chamber, but right next to it. That's why we have the instrumentation bench right next to the chamber, so we can have the shortest cable possible running from the participant to the meter. Why four independent walls? Elmer Green and company were lucky they did that. So they had the four walls up and down, front and back, and the fifth measure on the earlobe, and that was just enough information for that second paper, the Tiller Green et al. Paper, to work out the equivalent dipole source. Now, what those guys recommended going forward is the better measurement would be to have four electrometers, one on the earlobe, I think one on the solar plexus, one on the dantian, and one on the ankles, something like that. They wanted a measure up and down the body, so they could get a slightly better way of seeing that dipole effect. But by measuring in the walls, you are seeing the sort of radiated electric field, and there were some interesting things about that. As again, Professor Moga was pointing out in her presentation, you don't see the peaks on the body exactly matching the peaks that you see on the metal walls. So there's something interesting with that going on. And the other thing is the Tiller and Green paper, they were really recommending adding magnetic field measure to this. So, the optimal would be to have a magnetometer like Professor Moga is using in the copper wall and see, if those kind of magnetic fields are popping up when we're seeing the wild stuff going on with the electrostatic.
Right. Okay. So more questions incoming regarding the shielding. John McDonough is asking, have you tested the copper wall room without anyone in it? And a follow-up, why not have a Faraday cage? You left two walls off.
Yeah, the answer to the first one is yes. Like I was mentioning, I did maybe 2.5 months of almost 24/7 continuous running with nobody in the room, and the conductive connector we were using just sitting on top of the bar stool in the copper wall room, looking to see what you get. Nobody there, and like I mentioned, it was very stable, very low drift. Clouds didn't affect it. Lightning would affect the AC reading, so don't do measurements when there's a lightning storm lurking around.
Good
Why not
advice.
have a? Excuse me.
Good advice.
Yeah, yeah. I could tell you stories. Never mind. Um, why not have a Faraday cage? I don't think you really need it. Okay, I think the shielding on those four walls cuts down the AC induced power line interference considerably. You know, we've got to have some opening. That booth is pretty small. I think it might make people a little claustrophobic to have the four walls all closed in on them. And I don't think you really need it. So,
Okay, thank you very much. So we have another two questions over here. Yeah, so have you, or a general question, anyone you knew or any research you knew has considered any measurements for ionic changes may not be possible for the current setup or the follow-up setup that you're planning?
So I think if I'm interpreting this right, ionic current flow in the body must be what you're talking about. I don't think it is possible in our current setup, and I'm not exactly sure how you might do that.
The answer is yes to that to the ionic description that you mentioned.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know how a person would propose to do that kind of measure.
Okay, we'll wait for some proposals. Then it sounds interesting. And here's another question by Professor Robert Patterson. So you mentioned before that you saw 70 volts on the ear with grounded wrists, or
No,
that was
no,
a paper, right?
this was the 70 volts was measured on the ear with one connection to the body, no other connection to the body. So the body itself is not grounded anywhere. It's floating. The other side of the electrometer is connected to earth ground. Okay, so what you have is an electrically isolated person. They're on top of an insulating floor. We're trying to cut down any charge leakage into the environment to the absolute minimum. We were taking one measure on their ear, okay, relative to earth ground. That's the way it was done.
Okay, so I think this leads us to the end of the session, and for that, for the symposium. So thank you again, Dr. Dunseath, for that wonderful presentation and all the answering these very interesting questions